mentioning the satellite. Any suggestions people have, not just the content, but also the format, the process, very welcome. This is our third year, and every year the the aspiration is to do better than every the previous year. It's not going to be easy after what we saw in Pavia, but we'll try our best. Any suggestions you have, please send it to me or Sunny. Thanks.
Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Discourse Seminar of Fall 2024. Today, we'll have a presentation from Dr. Amélie Achim. Her topic is using the referential communication paradigm to study language production in schizophrenia during a joint task performed with an interaction partner. But first, please let me introduce Dr. Amélie. Dr. Amélie Achim is a full professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Neuroscience at Université Laval in Quebec City, and a researcher affiliated to both the Cerebral Brain Research Center and to Vitam, a sustainable health research center. She developed an interest in mental health research after working as a mental health worker. She entered university with the specific intent of becoming a researcher in the field of mental health, completing bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in psychiatry, and a PhD in neuroscience, with a focus on the brain correlates of memory in healthy participants and people with schizophrenia using fMRI. She then completed her postdoc as the Cerebral Brain Research Center, working on the epidemiology of comorbid anxiety disorder in people with schizophrenia. In parallel, developing her own research program on social cognition and verbal communication in people with schizophrenia, which is still the focus of her current work. And thanks. And if everybody is ready, and Amélie, are you ready? We can start.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Oh, I think this is going to be the file. Do you see my screen and myself for now, or?
Yes, actually, that's really neat. I didn't know you could do that. So we see you in the corner, and we see.
I saw briefly what you can see, but now I only see my presentation in super big. But it's gonna be good for today. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about some studies that we've done in my lab, but I also want to share some thoughts about language. And so to start, I want to just talk about the difference between language production versus verbal communication. So like, in principle, language and speech is meant to communicate. But when we approach language, and in schizophrenia research, that's often the case, we often think about language as getting some information out of ourselves. So like, it's more about like produce some speech, like get some information, get some verbal content out of yourself. But then like, it takes all its sense when you consider verbal production in the context of real interaction. And in this context, verbal production doesn't like stop at getting it out of yourself. It's also about getting it into somebody else, get to be well understood. So the idea is to get the other person to understand you. And for that, it's like, it's very well known in psycholinguistics that you do what we call audience design. So like a very easy example is like, if you're telling about your day to a 5-year-old versus to your colleague who knows very well the type of work you do during your day, you're gonna do it very differently. So there's an adjustment in the way you speak that's like based on who you speak to. So language is not just about getting language out of yourself, is getting it like well adjusted to be well understood by who you're speaking to. And just want to raise that like the understanding part like it's like by definition, social cognition is like all the processes needed to understand others. And like audience design is likely to also require social cognition, because if you want to address to the needs of the person you're speaking to, you need to think about their needs. Okay, so just before I jump more to schizophrenia, I want to give some background on like some important research that's been done about collaborative adjustment of speech, so adjusting to who you're speaking to. Pretty like maybe one of the most well-known studies is the study by Isaacs and Clark, and they're the ones who introduced the referential communication paradigm. So in the referential communication paradigm, you have two people interacting together. So in the case of their study, it was two different participants. And what they did is they gave New York postcards to both participants, the same ones. The first participant had the postcards in a predetermined order, and they had to tell the sequence to the other participant so that the other participant could place their postcards in the same order. And so the participant could not see each other. They had the same material, but there was a screen separating them, so they couldn't see each other. So it was really about verbal communication. And so what they saw is that like the participant, they spontaneously used more names for the monuments of New York when they had to present the postcard to someone who was from New York than when they were presenting the same monuments to people who were not from New York. So anyways, there was other conditions in the task and other details, but that's the main take-home message. Yep. And then there was another study a few years later with Wu and Kaysar, who started saying like, yes, but like it's all good, but then people use names for when they present things that their interaction partner has no way of knowing. So in their study, what they did is they had one participant, the director, who was seeing one shape, and the other person was seeing three shapes. So these were abstract shapes. And before the study, the two partners had learned some names for some of those random shapes. So they gave names to all the random shapes. Some were learned together. Some were learned only by the director, and others were named by none of the participants. So what they saw is that the director, the person presenting the images to the other person, used the names even when the other person had no chance of knowing. So they came and like they say, oh, the people speak in an egocentric manner. So like they think of themselves with their own view. They're not really collaborative. And then another study came afterwards with Eller, who repeated the exact same design. But then they didn't look at whether they named they didn't only look at the names, but they showed that like, yes, they used the name, but they would say like, it's a glue. It has like, it looks like a ghost with a kind of head on top, for instance. So like they didn't refrain from using the information they had learned, but they still adjusted. So then it was again like, oh, people are collaborative in the way they speak. Okay, so I'm telling you about all that because I think it's something in schizophrenia research we do not hear so much about. And it's very important to consider like a little bit like this like psycholinguistic background if we want to really understand what we're doing, what we're measuring. Okay, so after those these different sets of study, there was a debate between the two models of language. There's a lot of studies like for the different views and people arguing, but there was like two main models. So the collaborative model of language production and the two-stage model. So the collaborative model sees communication as a joint activity. It's something you do together. The idea that the knowledge that is shared between the partner is taken into account in their verbal production. But there's also the idea that through an interaction, you can develop shared knowledge and use that in subsequent parts of your verbal exchange. And then there's the two-stage model, mainly defended by Kessler, with the idea that people tend to both understand and produce language as a function of their own perspective. So they're initially egocentric, and it's only when the more automatic and easy egocentric way of doing fails that there's a second step where you readjust. So these are the two models. And there are evidence for both models. Susan Brennan, who's been very prolific in that field, came with a one-bit model. Is the idea that people are collaborative when it's very easy to establish the other person. So when you don't need to work too hard to adjust, you do so naturally, and otherwise you fail to do so. But then the idea is during everyday social interaction. So if we're going back to everyday social interaction, and I care a lot about that. In my intro, it was mentioned, I used to be before I was in research, I started getting interested in mental health because I was a mental health worker. And then I went to research afterwards, but this being in the field with the patients, in their everyday life, trying to bring them back to better functioning was sort of where I came from. So it always came back. So I always keep in mind what's the impact? Why are we interested about this if we care about social interaction? So during social interactions, in everyday life, the knowledge of the other person is not necessarily super clearly established. Abstract shapes is for sure, there is no real name in the world for that. For sure, people will know it. So it's relatively easy. And it's not necessarily also globally established, as in the study with the New York postcards, where if people are from New York, you can expect them to know most of the very famous New York monuments. And then, so we started thinking that maybe if you need to assess what the likely knowledge of the other person, that would require a theory of mind or social cognition abilities to infer the other person's mental model. So that could be necessary to infer other people's background knowledge, or which is important when you introduce new items in your discourse. But there's also an idea that the salience of different objects you're referring to can change as the discourse go on. So you can talk about something, then switch, then come back, and at different moments in the discourse. There's how accessible something you want to refer to is to the person in front of you can change as well. So we're gonna come back later about that. Okay, so so far we've been talking about how we refer to things. So this is referent choices in verbal production. And this is a citation I like. One of the most interesting facts about human language is that we can use different forms to refer to the same thing, and the same form can be used to refer to many different things. So it's the idea that I don't know, if I talk about Sunny, for example, I can refer to her with her name. I can refer to her as a researcher I know. I can refer to her as she, etc., etc. But a researcher I know could be somebody else also, is not necessarily her. So they're the same person or the same object can be referred to in many different ways. And the same ways can be used to refer to many different entities or persons. So and it's very important because not only choosing the right form, but choosing it at the right moment will orient the listener to what we're talking about and avoid ambiguity in discourse. And now I'm going to switch a little bit more. So that was more theoretical background, but now I'm going to switch a little bit more about ambiguities in the discourse of people with schizophrenia. And if we bear with me just 1 second, the sun is coming out and I have it in my face. I'll take a second to close the drapes. It's going to be less distracting. Sorry for that. Okay, so going back to ambiguities in the speech of people with schizophrenia, so that we can also call discourse failures. There's been a lot of work, initially by Rochester and Martin. They have a book, Crazy Talks, that's like very well known. Then other people, Phil Harvey notably, who worked on that also. And then he was I think the PhD advisor of Nancy Doherty, Phil Harvey. And then, so Nancy Doherty's work has focused quite a bit on discourse failures or ambiguities in discourse. And she put together a tool, a rating tool named the Communication Disturbance Index. So the Communication Disturbance Index allows for a systematic analysis of discourse failures in speech. So what you do, and just a second, so just to come back, so you can identify discourse failures, but you can also categorize the discourse failures into six types of ambiguity. So what type of unclear speech do you have here? And usually you do that based on free speech sample. So you use like usually in their lab, they use 10 minutes free speech samples. So they ask people, oh, tell me about like your favorite activities and speak about that for 10 minutes. Then they transcribe and code. So it's a very systematic analysis of all that has been said during that 10 minutes. And they calculate the rate of discourse failures per 100 words. Okay, and there's many studies using that tool and other tools as well. But if we focus on the CDI, many studies that showed increased rates of discourse failures in people with schizophrenia. So there are many studies. We are currently doing with the team of Carl Manner a meta-analysis of all the studies using CDI thus far, focusing mainly on schizophrenia, but also on other populations if we can find some. I wanted to mention that like the rate of ambiguities is more prominent in people with schizophrenia who present with symptoms of thought disorder, but it's also observed in the people who do not show thought disorder. So some people have suggested it could be a more sensitive measure than the thought disorder scales. I'm not quite as certain as we're currently coding that, and it doesn't seem to be so sensitive, so much more sensitive. But anyway, so I'll come back with that, with result on that maybe later on. But for now, let's just keep it at that. And just to say that also the rate of like failures or discourse failures or ambiguities are linked to its cognitive skills and also social cognition skills, including theory of mind. Okay, and I'm a little bit of a methods geek, so I want to just spend a little second talking about the type of speech samples that are used. So in those studies, it was usually free speech samples. So we're back to get some information out of yourself. It's not about communicate something to somebody else. It's not about sharing a thought. It's sort of in a sense, because like, still there's someone listening as you're telling, but there's no like point of it other than to produce language. But yet most of the studies using the CDI have used free speech samples, though I know that some of you, I think, have tried with other type of sample. When the measures of thought disorder usually rate the speech based on all the interactions with either the clinician or research assistant, but it's not based on a very specific sample. It's based more on what you notice throughout many interactions. It can also sometimes be used to rate the level of thought disorder in free speech sample or in some task-based speech samples. But then like task-based speech samples are more usually used in studies relying on the pragmatic approach or the psycholinguistic approach. Okay, and we cannot not mention the new natural language processing tools that are like very like the focus of many people in this group that are used to analyze various samples, including all those that are named there, but a much more wide variety of samples also. Okay, and there's evidence of speech impairments in people with schizophrenia from all those approaches. But one thing that we can notice is that there's very few studies using joint tasks. So like, what do we know about collaborative adjustment of speech in people with schizophrenia? Well, we don't know very much. There is one prior study that was done by Maud Champagne-Lavaux in collaboration with Marion Fossard, who's one of my very good collaborators, actually my best friend, several years back. So their study was based on the referential communication paradigm. So where one person presents a series of images to another person. In their study, they use also abstract images, so with the tangrams. They did 4 trials with the same images. Each trial was with the images in a different order, so the participant had to present the images. And their analysis focused specifically on the use of indefinite markers or definite markers. So for example, if you refer to one of these images as a gymnast or a sort of gymnast, it's an indefinite reference, a gymnast. If you say the gymnast, it's a definite reference. And there's all different reasons. We know that indefinite references are used mainly when you introduce new things in the discourse, and definite references are used more when you maintain things or reintroduce later the same elements. Okay, so in terms of their result, they found no group difference on the first trial of the task in terms of the use of indefinite or definite marker per number of words. But on subsequent trials, so the people with the group with schizophrenia, they used more indefinite references and less definite references than controls. So they didn't switch as the controls to more definite references. And they also showed that people with schizophrenia with lower scores on a theory of mind task, though it was a very not sensitive, like ceiling, they had ceiling effects, but when they did the median split, the people with schizophrenia with lesser scores on the theory of mind task were also more affected in their use of reference mark. And I just want to acknowledge that like some people in our group here also studied the use of indefinite and different reference markers in people with schizophrenia. So that was like studies by Dara Chakal that she did with Wolfram Insin. And in their studies, they also found that the use of definite references were affected, but it was not during a joint task. It was like based on a task where people had to describe some images or tell a cartoon story. So are there other prior studies using joint tasks to examine speech in schizophrenia other than the one that focus on a very specific aspect of speech? Well, there's very few. So there's a study by Dwyer who looked at linguistic alignment. So linguistic alignment is the idea that if we're speaking together and I refer to something a certain way, you tend to then refer to that same thing with the same words. So that's named linguistic alignment. So the one study showed the reduced linguistic alignment in people with schizophrenia. There's another study where they had groups of 3 participants discuss moral dilemmas, and I think they found that there was more time between speech turns in groups that had 1 person with schizophrenia. But then like we really tried to look and we didn't find much. So if you know of any other study, please send them to me and get me aware of this. But like my realization is that there's not much in that field. And so now we're going to turn to some studies we did in my lab. So I was telling you about my colleague and very good friend, Marion. She's from Université de Neuchâtel in Switzerland. And our studies were also based on the referential communication paradigm. So maybe this makes it a little bit more concrete for you. So you have the participant on one side, they have a series of images, the other person that does the task with them. In our task, it was always a research assistant. They have the same images in a random order and they have to place on the little like empty card as the participant speaks. So we developed different tasks based on the referential communication paradigm. One with separate images, that's the one that's illustrated there, but also two with images that form a continuous story. Okay, so if we go to our first task with separate images, the strategy that we use is that we manipulated the knowledge that the interaction partner is likely to have about the items being presented. So we had some movies, so we used movie characters as our stimuli. And the movie characters, we did a lot of surveys. It's quite a lot of trouble to use these tasks because we need to revalidate the stimuli every time. But anyway, so we did surveys to figure out which characters we could really see as very well known and people know that people know it well. So that was the likely known condition. And likely unknown, those are characters that other people may know, but not necessarily. So like without knowing very well, most of you, if I was to say Harry Potter out of a group of movie characters, I'm pretty sure most of you, if not all, would find who it is. But if I was to say Leonidas, I would probably add like more information for you to identify who it is. Okay, so these are the images that we used in our first version of this task. And the first thing we did is that we looked at the number of pieces of information used to introduce the movie characters. So the number and also the type. So like any character could be introduced or presented with their names. People sometimes use the title of the movie. They use some description. So like he has a red cape or a beard, for instance, would be descriptors. So we calculated, like we coded how many pieces of information participants used to spontaneously present each character. And just to say that was like only counting the items for which the participant themselves knew the characters. So we eliminated all the ones for which the participants didn't know. And so what we found was that in the LT controls group, participants had like a difference between the conditions. So they use more pieces of information when the other person was less likely to know, and less when it was a well-known character. And so the group with schizophrenia, they didn't show that modulation in the number of elements of information. So this led to a significant group by condition interaction. One thing that I thought was super interesting is that in our LT control group, and that's published in a separate study in the 2015 study, but in the group of LT participants, the how big the difference is for one participant was linked to their theory of mind performance. So people who had better score on a theory of mind task that we did separately were also the one to adjust more between the condition or to differentiate more by giving more information when the other person was less likely to know. Okay, just to mention that like here in the number of pieces of information, we see no adjustment in the schizophrenia group, but there was still some adjustment in the type of information provided. For example, they use the name of the characters more often when the character was well known. Okay, so that was our first task based on separate images. But like if we're coming back again to this idea of like in everyday life. So in everyday life, like it can happen that we have to introduce many objects one after the other, but it's not how we commonly talk to each other. When we talk, it's more narrative, it's more about like a story, it's more about continuous speech. It's not about one item, and then separate item, and then like, so there's more of a continuous aspect to it. So we had this idea of adapting the referential paradigm to continuous discourse. So we're the first one to actually do that. So this time we still had images that the participant had to present, but instead of presenting the images individually, we showed them a set of 6 images and we asked them, tell the story that you see, so that the person who has the same images in a random order can place the images in order as you speak. And just to say that in all those tasks, the person who listens can always provide feedback. So they can say, okay, or they can say, wait a second, I need more information. So there is really an interactive aspect to it. Okay, so we had 2 different tasks, narrative tasks with with different manipulations in each. So we had one based on movie scenes, and with again a manipulation of whether it was a movie that's likely known by other people or that's more likely unknown. And this was not between stimuli and the same story, of course, because it was like all the same story, but we have many different movie scenes, some from well-known movies and some from less known movies. And we also have another version that's the storytelling and sequence task that we developed also. And this one has a manipulation of referential complexity. So just to explain to you what's referential complexity is the idea that if you have a story with a single character, it's very easy to reference that character. If you say a man, the man, he, like anything you say that's so like, it's easily, the character is as easily identifiable. If you have 2 characters, then there's a little bit more risk of confusion, like who you're talking about at different points in your discourse. And even more so if the characters are of the same gender. So if you have 2 characters of different gender, you have only one he and one she. It's more like it's easier to distinguish. If you have 2 women, she can be any of them. The girl could be any of them. So people tend to use modifiers to help the other person to identify more clearly. So people would say, there's a brunette, there's a blonde girl, for example. So they would be more specific. So this is the idea of referential complexity, and that's manipulated in that other task. Okay, one other thing that's manipulated in those tasks is the idea of discourse stages. So I told you before that the same reference, so the same thing we talk about, can be referred in many different ways. And as the discourse evolves, there are like very specific ways in which we refer to things at different moments. So this was suggested in theoretical models, and we're the first ones to demonstrate it empirically. But there's the idea that there's 3 phases. So we can introduce a character, we can maintain a character in focus. So here, the character that was in focus in this image is still in focus, so is more visually salient and more active. Here, the brunette is still there, but the character that's more in focus visually and more active is another character. So there's a shift of who you're focusing on, and naturally people would use this character as the grammatical subject when they're starting to talk about this image. Then the blonde girl is maintained in focus, and then there's a shift back and maintained again. So why is that important? Is that when you introduce new characters, you tend to use indefinite references. When you maintain, you use pronouns. So here at the beginning, you wouldn't say like, there's a girl and a girl puts her towel on the beach. If you like say a girl again, it like some misleads people as like into thinking that, oh, it must be a different girl because like you introduce with indefinite reference. Okay, and usually the shifts occur with definite references. Okay, so it's not the idea of like learning all about like the types of like references and indefinite. It's just the idea of remembering that at different moments in the discourse, the types of reference you use will change, and it's like it will guide the listener to like the characters you're speaking about. Okay, and so we have those two tasks. We had a first group do the task with the movie scenes. We had the second group do the task with the cartoon characters, so the storytelling and sequence task. And we started doing some preliminary analyses of the reference markers used by people with schizophrenia. And some things came out, but we had the feeling we were missing something. So we still went on to code the choices of reference markers, but we also developed a new analysis strategy that was like more based on the subjective impression, and I'm going to tell you about those. So we have some interesting results, especially when people with schizophrenia were introducing the characters in the story. But we had like even more interesting results with the other analysis strategy. So our first study that looked at the reference markers in people with schizophrenia was with the movie narration task. And we also coded the same for the character identification task because we had the data for the same participants. And for each character, we coded the type of reference marker. So was it an indefinite reference like a man, a definite reference like the man, a pronoun he, or a name? In that case, in the case of the movie task, there's also the name of the characters that can be used. And like we also coded the stage of narrative elaboration. So in the storytelling and sequence task with the cartoon, it's very linked to the images. We tried to do the same for the movie scenes task, but it was too hard to have one character like in focus and visually salient, extracting the images from real movie scenes. So we were not able to do that. So we had like another procedure to determine. I'll pass you the details of that. If you're interested, let me know and I'll be able to tell you more about that. And again, the analysis included only the movies that the participant knew. And so this is a big graph. What I want to show is that the use of names is here, indefinite, definite, and pronouns. And for each, you have the identification task first, then introduction, maintaining, and reintroduction. So the first thing I want to emphasize, and listen to me rather than try to make sense of this, I'll try to guide you through it, is that there is a very strong influence of the stage of narrative elaboration. So for instance, pronouns are used pretty much during like very frequently during the maintaining phase, but much less at the other phases. Whereas like indefinite references are used pretty much only during the introduction and identification task. Though here is not like the rate is still not super high because people use the names of the characters as well. Okay, the other thing I want to raise to your attention is that there was like when effects of conditions, so between the likely known versus likely unknown characters were observed, they were typically observed across both groups. So people with schizophrenia seem to adjust. The only significant group by condition interaction that came up was for the use of different references during the introduction phase. And then we also found a significant group effect, but without an interaction for the use of names, again, during the introduction phase. So the only two results that we found were during the introduction phase, and for the rest, there didn't seem to be much. Okay, and this is interesting. It was the first study to use to examine a wider range of reference markers. So not only indefinite and definite references, but also names and pronouns. the first study to take the stages of narrative elaboration into account. We have pilot results with the other task, also for the use of reference marker that replicate the idea that it's mainly during the introduction phase that something's happening in people with schizophrenia. But then, like, I was reading the transcript and like looking at the stories, I feel that there's something. Like, you tell me it's just during the introduction that there's something in this group, but like I read it and I find it more difficult to follow. So like for instance, just one example, but like people with schizophrenia use like the girl, the other girl, and then the other girl. The first other girl is fine. Then the second and the third other girl, is it the first that you name the other girl, or is it the one that's not the preceding one? That's just one example. Or sometimes like they use the right reference markers, but like the same character at first was a little girl and at the end was a lady. So like those are extreme examples, but just to say that I had this feeling that the stories were more difficult to follow and that it was harder to place the images in order based on the transcript. So what we did is that like, so I was like, is it just me? You know, like sometimes we want things to be there. Like, so I was like, is it just me, or would other people who do not know about our task, who do not know who's a patient or who's not, would they also judge it more difficult to place the images in order to follow the story? So what we did is that we had a research assistant listen to the audio track. So we did it with the audio, not the transcript. So we did it with the audio. We gave them the images in a random order, asked them to place the images in order. And we asked them to take note of the order, just to know that we included also some scrambled stories. So we placed the images in a wrong order, had people tell the story, and this was like given to them in addition to the real participants. So they couldn't guess always the same order because all the participants had done the task with the stories in the same order. And so we have asked them to rate their subjective impression on a scale of 1 to 10 of what we call the facility, was like how easy or hard was it to place the images in order? Like how did they feel like it, how easy did they feel it was, or how easy or hard? While we were there, we also asked them how interesting the stories were. So on a scale of 1 to 10 again, from less interesting to more interesting. And remember that everybody was telling the same stories, it's based on the same images, but the way they told stories could differ. And then we also asked about the voice expressivity, also on a scale of 1 to 10. And 4 people did the same for each stories. They were all naive to who was a patient or a controller, or a scrambled, reordered story. And they didn't know about our hypotheses either. Okay, so first, when we look at the group effect, the difference between healthy controls and people with schizophrenia, we find that even if the raters didn't know, the participants with schizophrenia were rated as making it less easy, less interesting, and they were also found to be less interesting. So the data I'm showing you there is the ones from the movie scene, so that's been published already. But then we replicated the same results with a larger group of participants with the cartoon task. So that was like also there. We find that like the people with schizophrenia were rated as making it less easy, less interesting, and less, they were also judged to be less expressive. And I think it's important because, you know, like we talk a lot about stigma and about like how people perceive like or have like prejudice. But I think like this idea of like how like there's something that can be perceived by people naturally, even if they do not know about the diagnosis, I think is interesting to keep in. Okay, one other very important result, in my mind at least, that we found and replicated in both studies is the link between theory of mind performance and facility. So people with worse, like with better theory of mind performance, made it easier for others to put the stories in order, and that's in the schizophrenia group specifically, and it's like also observed in the other study. Okay, and something that we had not expected that came up is a strong link between how interesting the story were judged and expressivity. So, and that was across both, like that was in both groups. So in people with schizophrenia that we see up here, like the correlation were like very, very high. I'd never had correlation so high in a study. And then that was with the movie scenes. And then again, with the storytelling and sequence task with the cartoon, like even higher, like I couldn't believe like how strong, but this was a real correlation. Okay, so coming back again to this idea of language as we tend to study language as getting information out of ourselves, but I think it's very important to consider also the interaction partner's perspective, and that shows you that. I think these data can like speak directly of that. And just like to like, if we try to make a list, you know, like there's a lot of things like they're like in terms of expressivity, people with schizophrenia, like they have reduced voice expressivity, like prosody, like, and we saw in our study that was linked to how interesting people find that. But there's also reduced facial expression, reduced gestures, alogia, which is a symptoms meaning people use fewer words or do not speak as much. Thought disorders that make it harder to understand people, or that like makes it harder to like follow what they're trying to like tell us. But the idea is that people around them have fewer clues to fully understand them. So my background is more on social cognition before language. And so like, like we know that to understand others is based on the cues that you have, but if you have lesser cues, you may not be able to understand others as well. And I think it's very important to consider if like, we talk a lot about like the social withdrawal of people with schizophrenia. We know they also have social anxiety, and so they can like pull away from others. But what if like others would also be pulling away because they find them less interesting, or because they're uncomfortable with it, like because they do not understand them as well. So maybe it's not only on the patient side, maybe it's also on other people's side, that there is something that we can do to help people with schizophrenia be more like socially like included. Just to say that for expressivity, one thing that I think is super important about is the fine adjustment of medication, because like side effect of medication can reduce expressivity. And that's one thing we want to go back in our result and see what medication the patient had and the doses, and see if it has an influence on the different ratings. Okay, so first take-home message: verbal communication is much more than getting information out of yourself. It's highly dependent on the interaction partner. And we still have a lot to learn about the impact of the deficits that people with schizophrenia have and their symptoms during real interactions. And just to say very quickly, that we have many ongoing projects based on our data with the storytelling and sequence tasks, so the cartoon tasks. So we're coding again how easy or interesting it is, but based only on the verbal transcription. So we want to eliminate the expressivity aspect and see, based only on the verbal content, do our coders find people with schizophrenia less interesting if we remove the expressivity aspect? And if the answer is yes, it's going to be interesting. And if it's no, it's going to be as interesting. That's a PhD student in my lab doing that. We're also rating the CDI on the same data, the reference markers, and we've started some natural language processing with speech graph, and we have some preliminary data on the largest strongly connected component that suggests group effect, but also an effect of the story complexity and some interactions in some conditions. Anyways, there's many details there, but I'll be happy to eventually come back to tell you more about all that. So thank you all for your attention. And I'll be happy to discuss with you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Amélie, for this great talk. I think we can pass the discussion part. You can use your virtual hand or you can use chat box. If you want, Amélie, we
I
can
can
close.
stop sharing the screen and
Stop
put it
sharing.
back if needed. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Natalia has a question. Yes, please, Natalia.
Hi,
Hello,
Amélie.
Natalia.
I'm having some problems here with my internet. Hope you can listen to me. I could follow your speech. Very interesting. I do believe that when we design a protocol to in a theory basis, we gain a lot with the results, and it's easier to interpret what is going on. So I was wondering if you, based on your results, do you think that it might be a way to intervene or to do some kind of task or training that could improve this the sense of failure? What do you think about it?
It's interesting because like just yesterday we had two master's students defend their master's thesis, and they're both speech and language pathologists, and they were telling us that they've used the task. So their master's degree was about like building a guide for clinicians to use the storytelling and sequence task and trying to make it, because it's not the easiest task to understand, to administer. There's a lot of like details and the coding and all, but they designed a guide to be able to bring into the clinic. But what they were saying is that they tried the task with like 4 of their patients, and they like saw that like sometimes like just administering the task, it raised awareness, and like so like raised awareness in their patients of like how important it is to adjust to be understood by the person you're speaking to. And like I think like there's really something to build about it in terms of like getting people to reflect on what's needed for others to understand you, and like just knowing about audience design. And like I think like today like it would have been way too long to tell you more about social cognition, but like I find that when we think about language production of one person as meeting the social cognition of the other person, and what does the other person need. And so just like I think like in terms of psychoeducation, there's a lot we can do with that. So I used to think about the clinical implication of my work more in terms of like giving tools, like evaluation tools to the clinician. Now I think of it much more as like, how can we give like psychoeducation tools, like things that are much more easily applicable in everyday practice.
Yeah.
I don't know if it answers or...
Yes, it's the same that I felt here. Thank you.
Wolfram?
Yeah, hello everybody. Fascinating. I just wanted to mention one result in the 2022 paper that you also mentioned on the Turkish data by Daria Çokal. So we used an analysis scheme developed by Claudio for this, and Claudio predicted that for indefinite NPs as opposed to definites, you would see an earliness effect. So you expect the indefinites to come early and the definites later. And from what I remember, I haven't had time now to look it up, but from what I remember, this earliness effect was not there in the schizophrenia group. And that's in picture description. So in a very reduced and socially not as rich setting as you have used. So I found this interesting. I think it speaks to your results. I think there's really something to that dialectic of the NP types. And I'm very happy that you have taken this up.
Yeah, I find it interesting. And just one thing I didn't mention is that like in healthy participant, we showed that the use of the indefinite references is in fact much more affected by your own knowledge than by the knowledge of the other person. So like if you don't know about something, you say something, and then like it's been introduced, then you use other. But like if you know about like even in the movie, like the introduction of the movie characters or in the like people use much less indefinite references because they were talking about characters they knew. So they use the names, but also definite references. All that to say that even if people have mentioned that indefinite are used to introduce, it's like so much, it seems much more related to like your personal knowledge than to the other person's knowledge. Whereas like adding information, like modifiers in the reference seemed much more, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I
So like maybe like memory effects or something like that, and people with schizophrenia. So like the sense of like always introducing like or like
yeah. Yeah, I think it's super important. That was just a comment. I have a question too, but maybe I could ask that later.
yeah. Yeah, I'll be happy to speak more about it directly if you want. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right. I left you speechless.
No, we're also at the end of the hour, but I think if some so maybe some people will start to head out, but we can keep this going for a couple more minutes if there are additional questions.
Well, thank you all to your attention. I can stay another 10-15 minutes, no problem, if some people want to continue the discussions, but feel free to leave. I know it's
Wolfram, if you want, you can carry on.
Okay, so if you give me just a minute to make one point. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that reference or referential meaning has this social dimension that you investigate. I think that's fundamental, but I think apart from that, there's also something semantically fundamental about reference if you distinguish it from sense. I mean, Frege made this important distinction, sense versus reference, which is like the distinction between what we describe and what we identify using the description. And that's a bit like the distinction between man as a general concept and a man, which is an entity that we are picking out based on the concept. So these two things are fundamental in a purely semantic sense that plays into social cognition fundamentally. I just want to float an idea here that these are really two distinct dimensions of meaning for which we do not know the neural correlates, I think, that makes them distinct at the level of the brain. And I think we are also lacking a computational framework for describing the two. And I think they're completely distinct. So if you have a text of, let's say, 200 words, you might just have, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 entities in the sense of reference that are being made and tracked through what you're saying using these 200 words. So you have a conceptual semantic space and you have a referential semantic space. And as I say, the brain correlates of that and the computational mechanisms underlying both are two fundamental issues, which I think we have to tackle in the context in which we are right here, because schizophrenia affects the content of thought, and the content depends on reference or referential meaning in addition to conceptual meaning. So the point I'm trying to make is that what you're doing is absolutely fundamental from this social cognition perspective, but there's more to that problem. And I think it goes to the root of what meaning is in the first place and how meaning is organized.
Yeah, it's certainly super interesting, and like it's true that like I came from it at first from a social cognition perspective. So language came second, like to me, like it's like so more recent, but like yeah, it's like sort of like coming back to this idea like there's no like it's not a one-to-one link between like the conceptual meaning of what you think versus the way you refer to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like and like then like you have that from like you can address it from the the speaker's perspective, but also from the listener's perspective or from the other person's perspective of like no, we actually like the task with the movie characters, we adapted that for fMRI, and we had someone in during fMRI in the scanner present the characters to someone outside the scanner verbally, so that people spoke, and it's probably my most creative studies of all the studies I've ever done. It's in 14 participants, but it's like a proof of concept for the methods, but like it worked super well. Like we were able to avoid problems with the movement artifacts in fMRI using a sparse sample strategy where like you turn off the gradients of the scanner, let this person speak, and then time it so that you acquire images only during the peak of the hemodynamic activity. And like the brain regions that came out that were so like affected by like that were active during the condition where you could adjust to the other person versus not, were the same regions that you see in fMRI studies of theory of mind. So like strengthening this idea is it's not like we cannot make like reverse inferences, so we don't want to like, but it goes in the sense of like
Sunny?
I agree. I really agree that this, whether it's this referential component, both the social and semantic aspects of that are really important. I guess this is more, maybe this is a more open question. I've often thought that we should incorporate more tasks that elicit this type of information, but I'm not sure, like what you've used, Amélie, is like very astutely and like precisely designed, and it involves like, you know, in person, or like, I don't know if it has to be in person, but it involves a lot of interactions with probably very highly trained research coordinators who know the task very well, or other and it's like a pretty elaborate setup. And I've often wondered if there's a way to isolate these types of linguistic effects with a task that could be done, you know, in a more scalable fashion, like whether it's online or through an app or through a simpler mechanism. Anyway, that's something I've often tried to think about, but haven't been able to solve for myself.
Yeah. I know I gave some thoughts about like, could you do this like on the phone?
Yeah.
Really? No, like for example, like something that's more like, you know, explaining to like someone how to like fix a sink or something, you know, like you need to refer to like or like but yeah, if you want to make sure that you like sort of like adjust to the other person, and like you need another person.
Or maybe a chatbot one of these days. If maybe that's not too far off, but it's still
yeah, like certainly.
Yeah.
Rosa? We cannot hear you, by the way.
See me?
That you're muted still.
Yeah.
Not me.
Okay, now.
Yeah.
Excellent. Hello, everybody. Excellent talk, Amélie. Have you considered, or maybe you have explored executive functions, not only theory of mind, but executive functions in the participants of your studies too?
I don't have measures of executive function in the participants in that study, but it's certainly very important. And like, you know, for the study with the communication disturbance index, there's been studies showing links between like communication failures or ambiguities and executive functions in those studies, but like it's not something we have done. It's certainly something that would be very interesting.
Yeah, because
as well.
maybe frontal dysfunction, not only the social cognition deficit, maybe some this executive function is as well present in those participants in the patients.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
it could
and we
be
can think about like also working memory for like for the narrative task that you have, like, you know, like to follow between different like moments of the task.
Yeah, difficulties in memory
Yeah.
are to added to the difficulties in explore social clues around.
Yeah.
If you are not able to keep the information enough time to behave properly.
Yeah. I tend to consider like cognitive functions as like necessary for theory of mind, which is necessary for adjustment to others. So I tend to see like we have a meta-analysis on the link between cognitive function and theory of mind with one of my former students, Elisabeth Thibodeau, that was published like in recent years, where we saw that there's like a correlation, significant correlation in the literature between all the cognitive function and theory of mind. So like supporting this idea that like it's related, but there's also one study by Fanning with Morris Bell and Joanna Fisden, where like they showed that like people who have cognitive deficits pretty much always also have theory of mind deficits, but you can have theory of mind deficits even if you have like spared cognitive abilities. Anyways, all that to say that I see theory of mind as like a more encompassing that can come from like be second like primary or secondary to cognitive difficulties.
And maybe it's interesting to explore it separately.
I think that's borne out on the neuroimaging side as well. I believe social cognition like recruits broader networks than many other more defined neurocognitive domains.
And it's always a question of which baseline task you use.
Yes, that's also true. Yes, but I think we have to wrap up. But thank you so much for a fantastic talk. Many thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.